Jeremiah Carter had a long-standing knack for ruffling the feathers of Montana's wealthiest families, turning down marriage proposals from daughters they regarded as their most precious treasures. In a land where unions were measured in acres of pasture and head of cattle, Jeremiah had kept himself well clear of matchmakings born from ledgers and land deeds. He'd refused alliances with the most powerful ranching dynasties, declined grand weddings that promised influence in exchange for vows. But in the winter of that year, a widowed woman of color arrived. She carried no gold, no family name worth boasting over, only a worn leather suitcase, a heart once shattered, and a resilience no one could buy. And yet, within a few winters, the man who had sidestepped every calculated courtship stood at her side, shielding her from every whispered slight and open sneer. They were not merely lovers defying expectation. They were living proof that true love does not ask where you come from, but rather who you're willing to stand beside when the storm rolls in. Winter of 1882, Wyoming. The night wind slipped through the narrow seams of the tall windows, drifting into the great hall of Boone Rock Ranch, carrying the sharp scent of freshly fallen snow. Oil lamps fixed to the paneled walls cast a warm golden glow, spilling across floor tiles worn smooth with years and climbing the polished oak that lined the room. But the brightest light in the place did not come from fire. It came from silk, sequins, and gemstones catching the lamplight, shifting with the slightest motion of their wearers. On nights like these, Boone Rock Ranch became something akin to a silent auction everyone knew the rules to. Men in immaculate suits, brandy swirling in crystal glasses, young ladies in gowns embroidered with flowers or edged in lace brought from the east, and on the long table, set plainly in view, slips of paper bearing dowry agreements, marriage terms, and asset ledgers written line by line. At the head of the table, Jeremiah Boone sat upright, his left hand resting on a leather-bound ledger, his right hand holding a heavy fountain pen. Whenever someone approached, he lifted his gaze just enough to offer a courteous look, neither cold nor showing the faintest spark of interest. When introductions were made, his replies were clipped, sometimes no more than "I see" or "not necessary," before his eyes dropped back to the page, resuming the steady recording of the day's figures. To an outsider, it might have seemed like he was playing a role. But those who'd worked at Boone Rock Ranch long enough knew better. It was habit, not theater. He had built this empire from nothing. Balance sheets, hay prices, the winter head count of cattle, those were the things that held his attention. For the powerful families, however, a night at Boone Rock Ranch was an opportunity. They brought their daughters dressed in their finest illusions, hoping that gold's glimmer and silk's sway could thaw the reserve of that unreadable man. The girls had been taught to smile just so, to lift their gaze long enough to make an impression, and to lower it quickly enough to seem demure. Many a father and mother had sat across from Jeremiah, their voices booming or honeyed depending on the chosen tactic, reciting the expanse of their family lands, the political alliances that might bring advantage, the virtues and domestic skill of their daughters. Every compliment to Boone Rock Ranch, every carefully placed allusion to marital futures was laid out like fine goods upon the bidding block. Jeremiah listened. He did not argue. He did not smile. Now and then, his eyes would cut to the person speaking, as if weighing the true measure of both their words and their worth. Then the pen would resume its scratching, steady as a heartbeat, unbroken by the soft piano drifting from the corner of the room. Sometimes his silence turned the air rigid. A guest might chuckle nervously, a handkerchief dabbing at the brow, while the young women stole glances at one another, searching for the mistake they'd made. The truth was, none of them had erred, at least not by society's measure. The problem was simply that Jeremiah did not buy into society's measures. From the far side of the room, merchants and ranchers sipped their whiskey, trading glances as though placing wagers on which girl might hold his attention for more than a minute. As always, no one won. No one knew what exactly he was looking for, or if he was looking for anyone at all. But everyone sensed the invisible line that circled him, a boundary no one crossed without invitation. At Boone Rock Ranch, a night never ended with a nod of agreement. It ended when Jeremiah rose, shut the ledger, offered a few polite farewells, and left the hall. Soon after came the sound of hooves in the yard, carriage wheels grinding over packed snow, carrying silk dresses and strained smiles out through the black iron gates. The staff had grown so accustomed to this ritual they could predict the moment it would end. They began clearing the tables as soon as he stood, as though they'd heard a signal unspoken. And then the great hall sank back into its quiet lamplight, with empty benches and the breath of snowy air drifting in. Nights like these repeated weekly. To the town, Boone Rock Ranch was where power and opportunity shook hands. To Jeremiah, it was just part of the job. Receive guests, listen, decline. Nothing more. But what outsiders didn't see was that after every evening, his ledger held more than the costs of hospitality. It bore the names of each guest, their exact words, the glances they'd traded, recorded not to be remembered, but to be kept in reserve. And then the rumors began. That at Boone Rock Ranch, a careless word could cost far more than embarrassment. Stories spread of loans abruptly called in, trade agreements quietly voided, business doors shutting without notice. There was no proof, but everyone knew the thread tying it together led back to Jeremiah Boone's desk. That night, before the lights in the great hall had gone out, a new story was set in motion, one the town would whisper about for weeks to come. Darkness fell fast in a Wyoming winter. The moon pressed pale against a veil of thin clouds, its light glancing off the heavy snow. Jeremiah shrugged into his coat, pulled his hat low, and stepped onto the porch. His breath turned to steam before him, vanishing into the wind. From here he could see all of Boone Rock Ranch, the barns, the grazing land, the narrow trail that ran to town. Every acre was proof he'd lived on his own terms, without yielding. But he knew that if he kept to this course, a day would come when someone would try to break more than his holdings. They would aim for his name. He cinched the strap of his hat, a thought steady in his mind. If I must stand alone, then I'll stand alone. But I will not kneel. Somewhere out there, the snow was still falling, cloaking roads no one had, yet walked, waiting for those willing to set foot first. And Jeremiah Boone, the man no one touched, knew this winter would bring not only the cold wind, but something else entirely. Something he could not yet name, but felt pressing down like the weight of a gray Wyoming sky. That night, the snow fell heavier than usual. Large white sheets piled upon one another beyond the tall windows, as if determined to bury the road leading to Boone Rock Ranch. The great hall still glowed with lamplight, the scent of burning pine mingling with the rose and sandalwood perfumes of the guests. Among them was the Crawley family, one of the oldest banking names in the territory. Arthur Crawley took pride in a lineage rooted in Wyoming since the earliest days of settlement, while his wife, Helena, was certain their daughter Rebecca was the very picture of what a rancher's wife should be. Rebecca stepped in, the hem of her sea-green silk gown brushing the worn tiles, a pearl bracelet circling her wrist. Her smile, practiced for months before a mirror, was so precise it could strip confidence from other women with a single glance. When she reached Jeremiah, she dipped her head slightly, releasing the rare imported scent that few in this land had ever known. Jeremiah glanced at her for less than a heartbeat before returning to his ledger. The conversation unfolded like so many before it. Arthur boasting of property, lineage, and political reach. Helena adding polished remarks about her daughter's virtue. Rebecca, as trained, spoke just enough and no more. But when Jeremiah set down his pen and delivered his familiar phrase, "I appreciate the offer, but Boone Rock Ranch is fine as it stands," something broke from the pattern. Rebecca, instead of maintaining her smile, tilted her mouth into a smirk sharp enough to cut. "Perhaps you simply haven't met anyone capable of buying you off," she said, clear, measured, and loud enough for those nearby to hear. The room dropped a degree. Arthur swung his gaze toward her, eyes wide. Helena gripped her daughter's hand beneath the table, but Rebecca kept her stare fixed in challenge. This, for her, was retaliation, payback for being overlooked, for seeing her dress and perfect smile fail to stir the man in the head chair. Jeremiah didn't answer at once. He tilted his head slightly, regarding her with an unreadable expression, neither anger nor amusement, before giving a small nod, as though tucking away a note for later. Then he rose, offered parting words to the table, and walked out, leaving behind a silence thick enough to press against the ribs. The night went on much as any other for the remaining guests. Yet in a corner, a few merchants traded puzzled looks. They'd seen Jeremiah brush aside jabs before, but the look he gave Rebecca tonight, it was different. 3 days later, the first rumors began to trickle from town. The Crawley Bank abruptly froze all active loans. Clients dependent on its credit found themselves paralyzed. Delivery contracts collapsed. Ranchers lost the funds needed to buy winter feed. The news traveled faster than the winter wind. No one could say why the Crawleys' capital had seized up, but a few keen minds saw the line between events. Arthur Crawley had both borrowed from and done business with Boone Rock Ranch, and nearly all dealings had passed through Jeremiah. When asked, Jeremiah said only, "I don't decide how others live, but everyone harvests what they sow." The Crawleys scrambled. Arthur reached out to old partners in Cheyenne and Denver, but all declined further investment, citing unfavorable conditions. Helena wrote to a distant cousin back east for urgent funds. The letter went unanswered. Rebecca, who had once stood in the great hall to mock Jeremiah, now sat in a dim parlor, the family forced to sell furniture to settle debts. Her sea-green gown lay folded in a cedar chest, with no chance to gleam again under Boone Rock's golden lights. In town, the tale grew with each retelling. Some swore Jeremiah could ruin the Crawleys with a nod. Others claimed he never forgot or forgave a public insult. True or not, the lesson rippled through the upper tier. At Boone Rock Ranch, words could cost more than pride. They could cost an entire fortune. After the Crawley affair, the evenings in the great hall grew quieter. Smiles were more cautious, compliments more sincere, and the young ladies spoke less after being refused. Jeremiah still sat at the head of the table, still turned the pages of his ledger at the same measured pace. But the air had changed. Defiance had vanished, replaced by a wary respect. Jeremiah never brought up the Crawleys again, nor did he need to. He knew true power didn't lie in raised voices, but in ensuring people understood he could and would act when it suited him. That night, when the last carriage rattled away and the hall fell silent, Jeremiah stood alone by the window, watching the snow drift down. Firelight traced the sharp lines of his face, glinting faintly on the silver at his temples. He neither smiled nor frowned, simply stood as a man long accustomed to both respect and solitude. In his mind, stories like the Crawleys brought no satisfaction, only markers, reminders that Boone Rock Ranch endured and thrived all because of the way he guarded it. And no one, whether through words or influence, would lay a hand on it without paying the price. Outside, the wind howled over the white fields, carrying fresh rumors into every saloon and card table in town. And in those whispers, Jeremiah Boone's name grew heavier. Not just the wealthiest man in 3 counties, but a man no one dared mock twice. The winter of 1882 in Wyoming was unlike any that had come before it. The sky hung like a vast sheet of gray steel over the land, heavy enough that daylight brought no more warmth than night. Snow didn't fall in gentle flakes. It came down in thick, weighty sheets that clung to everything, burying fences, roofing barns, and smothering the narrow trails leading out of town. Against that brutal backdrop, Boone Rock Ranch stood like a fortress. The main buildings, their thick pine walls and high roofs built to withstand both winter gales and summer storms, were anchored deep into the frozen earth. The barns and granaries were set close together, forming a compound where everything, from livestock to the ranch hands, could be kept safe once the snow began to pile against the gates. At the center of that stronghold was Jeremiah Boone. 6'3", shoulders as broad as a doorway, he moved with the slow, weighted stride of a man who had spent a lifetime in the saddle. Black hair, silvered at the temples, framed a square-cut face where steel-gray eyes reflected everything, yet revealed nothing. Boone Rock Ranch had not been a gift of inheritance. Jeremiah had built it from nothing, starting with a small tent and a handful of half-starved cattle bought cheap from failed drives. He'd sunk his own fence posts, raised his own barns, and ridden herd through nights so cold the skin of his hands split open. Folks said he worked like 3 men rolled into one and slept less than a railroad watchman. Now Boone Rock spread across thousands of acres, rolling summer pastures that turned to white plains in winter, home to herds so large they were counted in hundreds at a time. The name Jeremiah Boone carried far beyond the 3 surrounding counties, into the saloons of Cheyenne and the merchant houses of Denver. For the past 3 years, Boone Rock Ranch had been known for another reason. Jeremiah refused every bride the powerful families sent his way. From the judge's daughter in town, to a banker's heiress from Cheyenne, to the governor's own niece. Each left with her pride wounded, her prospects dimmed. They had come hoping to step into wealth and influence. They all departed with empty hands, and sometimes with rumors or disgrace clinging to their names. Jeremiah never offered explanations, never tried to soften the blow. When asked, he gave the same few words. Boone Rock Ranch is fine as it stands. Then he returned to his work as if the matter had never been raised. That winter, with the snow thick and the wind cutting through the fence lines without pause, the legend of the untouchable man grew in every saloon and parlor. People speculated on why he refused them. Some claimed he still nursed an old heartbreak. Others swore his pride wouldn't allow another soul too close. Still others believed he'd vowed never to let Boone Rock fall into outside hands. Whatever the truth, everyone agreed on one thing. Jeremiah Boone could not be easily swayed. His presence alone could still a conversation mid-sentence. When he rode into town, arguments broke off, and men stepped aside. Even the loudest voices in the saloon dropped to a murmur. Mornings at Boone Rock Ranch began before dawn. Jeremiah emerged in a thick sheepskin coat, old gloves worn soft to his hands, and a wide-brimmed hat to turn the wind. He made his rounds, checking the cattle herded close to the barns against the storm, glancing over the feed stores, then walking the northern fence line where the wind bit hardest, testing each post for the slightest give. The hands had grown used to such thoroughness. They knew Jeremiah never gave an order he hadn't already carried out himself. It was why he was respected and feared in equal measure. He paid fair, defended his people against any threat, but would not tolerate carelessness or dishonesty. Rumors had always swirled around Jeremiah Boone, but most were nothing more than guesswork. No one knew the truth, until the winter 3 years ago. It was a late December afternoon, the snow falling fine and steady, the north wind cutting through town like it meant to slice ears from heads. Jeremiah rode in to attend a closed-door meeting with the council. Folks saw him turn into the stone building of the town hall and vanish inside. The meeting lasted more than 2 hours, and when he emerged, his expression hadn't changed. Yet anyone looking closely could see the set of his shoulders was tighter than usual, his eyes just a shade colder. What had happened behind that door trickled out in fragments, pieced together into a clear picture. The town council, made up of men holding the reins of political and economic power in 3 counties, had suggested, though it was closer to a demand, that Jeremiah take a wife. Not just any wife, but a white bride of suitable pedigree from one of the old or wealthy families of the region. The reasons they offered sounded noble enough. To uphold Wyoming's reputation in the eyes of other territories, to ensure Boone Rock Ranch remains a symbol of strength and purity for this land, to secure alliances among the region's leading families. But Jeremiah heard the truth behind the words. Once he married a woman of their choosing, Boone Rock Ranch, the thing he had built with his own hands, would be tied into their web of interests. One councilman, a silver-haired banker, reportedly said outright, "Boone Rock Ranch is part of Wyoming's face to the world. You wouldn't want it talked about, in ways that don't suit, would you?" Jeremiah didn't answer right away. He stood by the window, looking out at the snow-covered square, listening to the wind scrape across the tiles. Then he turned back, voice low but sharp. "I built Boone Rock Ranch with these hands. It doesn't need another name to keep it standing. And it will never be a prize in your bargaining games." The room fell silent. A few men frowned. Others kept their polite smiles. But Jeremiah saw it in their eyes. The sting of being refused outright. From that day forward, his relations with the upper tier grew strained. They still came to the ranch, still sent their daughters in the hope of changing his mind. But every meeting carried calculation now. Jeremiah remained courteous, still received guests, but the line between him and them became more defined. No one, not even the council, would decide his life for him. His defiance marked him as an oddity among them. At grand gatherings in Cheyenne or Denver, the mention of Jeremiah Boone's name often drew a smirk or a shake of the head. The man who thinks he's above the game. But Jeremiah didn't care. He knew that the moment he yielded, everything would change. A chosen wife would bring her family, their interests, and hands reaching into his decisions. Boone Rock Ranch, instead of being his fortress, would become a bargaining chip on someone else's table. Word of the meeting eventually leaked, through servants carrying tea or a doorman lingering too close. The details were bent in the retelling, but one fact stayed solid. Jeremiah had refused, and he had refused publicly. That made him a thorn in the side of some, and a man worthy of respect in the eyes of others. The ordinary folk, used to seeing power traded over whiskey, who for once saw a man stand up and say no. Still, the price of defiance was steep. In the months that followed, Jeremiah faced subtle blows. Supply contracts delayed without reason, deals pulled back at the last minute, whispers about Boone Rock's finances drifting through town. He never defended himself in public, but behind the scenes, he tightened his circle, found suppliers from unlikely places, and kept every part of the ranch running without pause. What irked the council most was that Jeremiah never weakened. Boone Rock Ranch grew stronger with each passing winter. His silence and endurance became their own form of statement. Boone Rock needed no one's protection but his own. In time, would-be brides still came, but none crossed the invisible threshold he kept around himself. The upper class began to accept, grudgingly, that perhaps he would never marry, or at least never on their terms. To them, that meant Jeremiah Boone would remain an aggravating unknown, a piece on the board that refused to move. To those who worked for him, it meant something else entirely. Proof he would never sell himself, or them, to anyone's power. That morning, the snow lay thick as a white quilt across the open range. The world was so still that the groan of the old wooden fence under the snow's weight could be heard in steady beats. Boone Rock Ranch woke as it always did. In the yard, a few hands were driving cattle closer to the barley store to feed them. Smoke rose from the house and barns, curling into the pale air, mingling with the warm breath of the herd. On the porch of the main house, Jeremiah Boone stood with arms folded, sweeping his eyes over the spread as he did each morning, gray eyes searching for the smallest sign of anything amiss. Through the white haze, a flicker of movement caught his attention. At first, just a shadow. Then the shape of a lone rider emerged. Not the rattling coach and team that came from town, not the deep wheel ruts in the snow that signaled a party of callers. This was a solitary figure, wrapped in a thick gray coat, sitting straight in the saddle of a plain, dark bay horse. Jeremiah stayed where he was, narrowing his gaze. The horse wasn't of any rare stock, but it moved sure-footed and steady, proof it was kept by someone who valued endurance over show. The rider wore heavy trousers, boots crusted with snow, and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low against the wind. No glitter of jewelry, no swish of expensive fabrics like the prospects the town sent his way. As the rider came closer, Jeremiah saw she was a black woman, slender but with squared shoulders, her gloved hands steady on the reins. Swinging down from the saddle, she moved with the ease of someone used to doing for herself. No waiting for help, no hurry in her step. She tied the horse to a post by the gate, patted its neck, then lifted her head and looked straight toward the porch. 20 paces lay between them, but her gaze, calm, unflinching, seemed to close it. Her voice carried, low and warm, needing no extra volume to cut through the wind. "I didn't come to marry you. I came to talk, if you'll allow it." The words fell into the still yard, without the softening of a polite smile or the dip of a deferential nod. Jeremiah tipped his head slightly, as though to be sure he'd heard right. For years, every woman who crossed this gate had come with a single, assumed purpose, and now here was one who began by denying it outright. He stepped down from the porch, snow crunching under the leather soles of his boots. He stopped a few strides from her, eyes still measuring. "You know who I am?" I do. The reply was short, certain. And you know why most come here? I do, but that's not why I came. Jeremiah studied her in silence for a moment longer. This woman, Clara Johnson, as he would later learn, had a face that wouldn't turn heads in a market square, but a presence that wouldn't be forgotten. Sun-browned skin weathered by wind, a few loose coils of hair straying beneath the hat brim, and eyes deep brown, holding something hard to name. From the Chelsen main house, Tom Bradley, his longtime foreman, stepped out, but Jeremiah lifted a hand to hold him back. Between him and Clara was a pause, not awkward, but the kind that forced each to weigh the next step. At last, Jeremiah nodded toward the gate. Come in. I can't promise I'll listen for long. Clara inclined her head slightly, without any overdone show of gratitude. She turned back to her horse, laid a hand against its neck, murmured something, then followed Jeremiah into the yard. As they walked toward the house, Jeremiah noted her stride, neither hesitant nor hurried, as if she were used to stepping into places where others might expect her to remain outside. He didn't know why she'd come, but in that instant, he recognized something he hadn't allowed himself to feel toward a female visitor in years: curiosity. When they reached the porch, the wind came harder, spinning a few flakes across the boards. Jeremiah went up first and opened the door. Clara paused for the barest moment, looking inside before stepping across the threshold. It wasn't hesitation. It was the deliberate act of someone taking in every detail on their first entrance into a place. Inside, warmth rolled from the hearth, the scent of burning wood mingling with the faint trace of morning coffee. Clara peeled off her gloves, revealing sun-browned hands, the hands of someone who knew real work. Jeremiah noticed, but said nothing. He led her toward the kitchen, where the light was softer and the wind outside became only a distant hum. Later, Jeremiah would remember that meeting not for anything Clara said, but for how she appeared, a lone figure against the white of winter, carrying no perfume, no sweet words, no circling pleasantries. Just a single, straight-spoken sentence, enough to break the pattern he had lived in for 3 years. And though he didn't yet know her true purpose, Jeremiah understood that on that morning, when Clara Johnson stepped onto Boone Rock Ranch, something, small but certain, shifted in the still air of that place. That morning, the wind cut across the pasture like a thin blade, carrying with it the smell of thawing ice from the far hills. Clara's horse had barely halted before the gate of Boone Rock Ranch when the big south barn door swung open. A lean but wiry figure stepped out, wrapped in a faded wool coat, a basket of hay cradled under one arm. It was Samuel, longtime hand of the ranch, his hair peppered with gray, spilling from beneath the brim of his hat, eyes sharp enough to see through the snow's veil. He didn't come forward right away, only stood for a moment, as though measuring the distance between them. When Clara adjusted the reins, he moved toward the gate, voice low and steady, each word landing like it was being set into the frozen ground. You don't belong here. Clara looked up, the wind blowing strands of hair against her cheek, her dark eyes steady. Samuel stopped at the wooden gate, his rough hand resting on the latch. There are families in this town, he said slowly, who only need to see your skin to start working on ways to drive you out. And if you think Jeremiah Boone will plant himself between you and them just because you knocked at his gate, you're mistaken. He doesn't stand in front of anyone unless he sees a reason worth it. Snow fell in a thin layer over Samuel's shoulders. The smells of horse, hay, and cold air mingled, making his words feel like part of the land itself, chill but true. Clara didn't answer at once. She met his gaze without flinching, then swung down from the saddle. Her plain leather boots sank lightly into the snow with a muffled crunch. "I understand," she said, her voice not loud, but steady enough the wind couldn't take it. "But I didn't come here looking for someone to protect me." Samuel's brow tightened, as if weighing whether she was naive or reckless. He glanced toward the main house, its square windows glowing faint in the morning haze. "You know," he went on, "most folks who come here leave quiet. Nobody says what happened inside. Boone Rock Ranch isn't a place you walk into easy, and it's harder still to stay." Clara peeled off her gloves, showing sun-browned, work-sure hands. She smoothed her palm over her horse's neck, her gaze never leaving the big timbered house. "I'm not looking for a place to stay," she said. "I'm looking for a conversation. That's all." A silence stretched between them, broken only by the rush of wind through the pines and the slow creak of the gate's hinges. Samuel looked at her one last time, his eyes holding not just caution now, but the edge of curiosity. Then he lifted the latch, letting the gate slide through the snow. "Then, go on in, but don't expect anyone in there to smile at you." Clara gave a small nod and stepped through. Her boots left dark impressions on the white, each step seeming longer across the wide, empty yard. The air was so still she could hear the faint rattle of chain along the fence. When Samuel turned back toward the barn, he paused to watch her retreating figure. In his eyes was a mix of doubt and a thin thread of respect. Not many, white or black, walked through Boone Rock's gate after hearing a warning like that. Ahead, the main house stood clear now. The pine siding was weathered, the steep roof dressed in a thin sheet of snow. Smoke rose from the chimney, thinning into the gray sky. With every step, the cold seemed to slip deeper into her coat, but her hands stayed loose, her pace steady. She knew fear wasn't absent, only buried. The quiet hatred this town held for someone like her was nothing new. But if she walked only safe roads, she'd never reach the places she needed to. And today, that place was the door of Boone Rock Ranch. Samuel stayed at the gate, watching until Clara laid her hand on the black iron handle of the main door. Maybe he was wondering how Jeremiah Boone would react to seeing this woman standing before him. Maybe he was already hearing the rumors that would drift through town by sundown. But for Clara, none of that mattered as much as the first words she would speak when the door opened. The stove fire cracked and popped, pine smoke mingling with the thick weight of warmth. Outside, snow kept falling in a steady hush, each flake erasing the world beyond Boone Rock Ranch's timber walls. The wide kitchen table, walnut darkened with age, gleamed faintly where years of linseed oil had been rubbed in, reflecting the golden flicker of the fire like a dim, uneven mirror. Clara sat at the edge of a chair, back straight but not rigid, her hands resting lightly on her knees. They were work-worn hands, mapped with fine nicks like thin knife lines, traces of the small, endless labors a woman shoulders when no one else is there to help. On her left wrist ran a crooked scar, its pale edge blending into her skin, but Jeremiah had marked it the moment she stepped through his door. She began to speak, her voice level, without rises or falls, as if what had happened no longer had the right to pull her back into the pit. She told of a marriage without love, of a husband who saw his wife as property and his hands as weapons. The beatings came when the doors were locked, the lamps blown out, when thick earth walls and the winter wind swallowed every sound. Clara had once believed that silence might let the storm pass. But silence, she learned, didn't save. It only made the violence feel familiar. She told of the night that changed everything, a rage without cause, a blow that sent her head into the iron of the stove. When she came to, she saw her own blood spread across the wood floor. The worst of it wasn't the pain, but the knock at the door that followed. A neighbor looking past her to ask if he was all right. They saw the blood, saw the bruises, yet no one touched her. No one helped her up. In their eyes, her skin color had already written the story, that whatever had happened, she was to blame. The next day, Clara left town. No goodbyes. Nothing taken but the clothes on her back and the wide-brimmed hat on her head. Since then, she had worked where work was found, on ranches, in kitchens, sometimes at the washtub. Each stop taught her something: how to shoe a horse, how to bind a wound, how to stay safe when night came long. Most of all, how to stand back up. Jeremiah sat opposite, a mug of black coffee in his hand, the steam curling around the handle. His eyes didn't leave her, and he offered no hollow comforts. He listened as if each word was being carved into the wood between them. When Clara finished, Jeremiah set the mug down, leaving a damp ring on the walnut. He told his own story, shorter not because it hurt less, but because he'd never been one to use many words for pain. He had loved a woman once. She wasn't born into power, but she wanted its company. Jeremiah thought love was enough to hold her, that days working side by side under the sun and nights at the fire would be foundation enough. But another man came, with promises of a grand house in Cheyenne, silk dresses from Kansas City, and parties without the smell of horse sweat. She left without looking back. Jeremiah hadn't called after her. He'd stood on the porch, watching the wagon wheels turn until they vanished behind the hills. Since then, he'd built invisible walls around himself. Every marriage offer from the territory's powerful families was turned away, not from bitterness toward women, but from knowing that if someone came for Boone Rock Ranch, they'd leave the moment they found a Boone Rock richer, bigger. Clara listened through to the end, then gave a small nod. It wasn't the shallow nod people offer out of politeness. It was the nod of someone who knew what loss looked like from the inside. Silence stretched between them, but it wasn't an empty one. It was like a wordless passage where two different melodies suddenly found a shared note. The stove fire gave a sharp pop, sealing the moment. Jeremiah understood then that both of them carried scars, some visible, some buried, and that not everyone had the courage to name them in a stranger's kitchen. Clara, with her steady voice and unblinking eyes when speaking of the past, hadn't come to Boone Rock to ask for pity. She had come to be seen. And perhaps, Jeremiah thought, he had just seen her. For the first time in years, he'd seen anyone at all. The fire in the stove hissed and breathed, swallowing each stick of dry pine as though it were listening to a story pulled from the darkest corner of memory. Clara didn't look at Jeremiah right away. Her eyes stayed on the flames, but her voice reached toward a place far off, a place that smelled of burning wood, rang with screams, and carried the searing bite of heat through skin to the bone. You remember, a few years back, when some of those brides were sent to you from the east? She began slowly, as if rewinding the years in her mind. Jeremiah gave a short nod. He hadn't forgotten. Each time the town would stir with whispers, that the council had found someone worthy of him, that a marriage would raise the standing of the whole region. but never once had he agreed. "One of them," Clara said, her hands tightening in her lap, "was my ex-husband's cousin. She didn't come here just to marry you. She came to make sure I disappeared." Jeremiah stayed still, but his gaze sharpened. The name flickered to life in his mind. Evelyn Price. A woman with hair like corn silk, a practiced softness in her eyes, and a voice sweeter than molasses. He remembered her arriving with a string of reasons wrapped in gentleness, but her eyes had never hidden the calculation. He had refused her, thinking simply they didn't fit. Clara clearly knew otherwise. "After I left my husband, she treated me like the family's stain," Clara went on, her voice low, but each word striking the wood floor like a nail. "She paid 2 men from this town, not far from here, to set my house on fire. I was inside when they did it." Jeremiah heard a faint sound, maybe the stove's timbers shifting, maybe a wire in his own chest drawing tight. "And no one helped you?" Clara's laugh was thin, stripped of warmth. "No one. Neighbors stood back, saying someone like me must have brought it on herself. I crawled out with a burned shoulder and a lifetime's worth of smoke in my lungs." The fire leapt higher, casting a red halo across Clara's face. The scar along her neck and shoulder glimmered in that light, proof that time hadn't erased what had been done. Jeremiah felt a different kind of cold settle in his chest, not from the winter outside, but from the knowledge that those council bride selections were not harmless parlor games. They could be weapons, punishments aimed to erase those who didn't fit the order. Clara lifted her gaze to him. "I'm not telling you this for pity, but you should know, some folks around here don't just want to control you. They want to wipe out anyone who's ever challenged them. And me, I'm someone they want gone." Jeremiah leaned back in his chair, one big hand wrapped around a coffee mug gone cold. The firelight on the table no longer felt like comfort, but a warning, reminding him that even the safest ground can be burned if left undefended. He thought of the council, meetings he'd walked out of, the handshakes he'd refused, the set jaws of land barons whose offers he'd declined. Now he understood. They weren't just angry at his defiance. They'd strike at anyone who defied their unspoken rules. "Evelyn still around?" His voice was even, but the weight in it was hard. Clara shook her head. "Heard she married again, a horse trader down south. But don't think that ends it. The men she hired to torch my home, they're still here, and they haven't forgotten their work." Outside, wind screamed through the gaps in the doorframe. Jeremiah set the mug down and tapped his fingers lightly on the table, his habit when weighing his next move. "You think they'll try again?" "Not think," Clara said, her tone unyielding. "I know, and this time they won't just burn a house." The words hung in the kitchen, threading into the pop and crackle of the fire. Jeremiah didn't speak at once. He studied the woman across from him, eyes too used to being doubted, voice trained not to tremble even when speaking of her own nightmares. He recognized it for what it was, not a plea for rescue, but the rare offering of a truth he was meant to hold. Finally, he nodded once, slow and certain. "Then if they come again, I'll meet them in a way they won't expect." Clara tilted her head slightly, measuring him, weighing whether his words were just politeness, but the cold light in his eyes answered for him. The fire between them flared higher, and not just because another log had fallen into the embers. Outside, snow kept falling. But inside Boone Rock Ranch, something had shifted. This was no longer a morning's talk between two strangers. It was the moment when two strands of the past, one scorched, one abandoned, twisted together into an unspoken vow. If the fire came back, it would not take anyone else. News that Jeremiah Boone, the man who owned Boone Rock Ranch, had welcomed a black woman into his home moved through the valley faster than the winter wind. Wyoming was no stranger to gossip, but few stories rattled the town the way this one did. People talked every which way, that he'd been bewitched, that she'd come to take his money, that he was deliberately provoking the most powerful families in the territory. Every retelling came with a little extra detail, and within 2 days, the tale had hardened into something most folks believed was truth, though no one had heard a word from either Jeremiah or Clara. On the third morning after Clara's arrival, a line of carriages rolled straight from town to Boone Rock Ranch. Fresh snow lay thick, the wheels crunching over ice, the hoofbeats echoing through the valley like a warning. From the upstairs window, Jeremiah watched them file into the yard. A knot of men in long overcoats, hats dusted with snow, stepping down with deliberate weight. Behind them came several women wrapped to the chin in heavy scarves, faces half hidden by lace veils, though their eyes carried enough frost to close the distance between them. They carried no rifles in their hands, but Jeremiah knew their real weapons today were words and the social power behind them. In the kitchen, Clara was at work. When the hoofbeats stopped, she glanced up once. A young hand came running in, face drawn tight. "Boss, there's a crowd. Town council. And the Whitmores." The name alone was enough to drain the sound from the room. The Whitmores didn't just have money. They controlled almost single-handedly the water rights from the Powder River, and Boone Rock Ranch, for all its size, couldn't entirely step outside that influence. Jeremiah understood. This meeting wasn't social. The great hall was readied in haste. The fire in the hearth was stoked high, though it couldn't warm the chill that came in with the guests' stares. The cowhides on the walls, the heavy oak chairs, everything seemed to shrink under the air of a courtroom. Jeremiah took his place at the head of the table. The familiar leather-backed chair turned into the judge's bench by circumstance. Across from him sat 5 men from the town council and 3 of the most influential women from eastern Wyoming. At the far end, Clara sat straight-backed, eyes on the fire, as though its warmth was the only neutral thing in the room. The first to speak was Samuel Hartwell, head of the council and once a hunting companion of Jeremiah's. There was no trace of that camaraderie in his voice now. "Jeremiah, we're not here about your private life. This is about reputation. Boone Rock Ranch is the symbol of this territory. Having someone like Miss Johnson here will damage our image with investors from the east." Another man cut in, voice like frost on steel. "You know as well as we do, Wyoming isn't ready for associations like this." Each phrase pushed Clara further from the table in spirit, if not in place. But she didn't flinch. She tipped her head slightly, gaze steady, and Jeremiah saw that her composure unsettled them more than fear ever could. They were used to seeing fear in the eyes of those they scorned, not calm. Mrs. Whitmore alone leaned back in her chair, her tone the smoothest, her words the sharpest. "We don't want to cut Boone Rock off from the river. But if you keep this presence in your house, it will be hard to ensure a smooth summer." Jeremiah let them speak it all. He rested both hands on the table, watching the flames in the hearth. Only when the room's silence had thickened did he answer, slow, each word deliberate. "Boone Rock Ranch has never let outsiders decide who crosses its threshold." A sharp intake of breath hissed from somewhere among the council. It was then Clara turned her head, met Mrs. Whitmore's eyes, then the rest of the table. I didn't come here to cause trouble for anyone. But if the only reason you think I'm a danger is the color of my skin, then maybe the danger isn't me. A few soft, derisive chuckles rippled, as though they'd heard something absurd. Jeremiah didn't laugh. He knew it was her plain-spoken truth that they feared most. The meeting stretched past an hour, most of it veiled threats and reprimands wrapped in polite diction. When the carriages finally pulled away, the yard fell quiet again, save for the deep hoofprints pressed into the snow. Jeremiah went to the kitchen, where Clara was pouring tea. He said nothing at first, just pulled out a chair across from her. Steam from her cup blurred part of her face, but her eyes were still as clear as they'd been the morning she'd appeared at his gate. "They'll be back," Jeremiah said, voice low. "And next time, it won't just be words." Clara set the cup down, her fingers brushing the scar on her left wrist, a reflex when memory drew too near. "I know. But if you think I'll leave to save myself the trouble, you're wrong." Jeremiah understood then that what had just happened was not only a test for Clara, it was a test for him. He'd never had to stand for someone else against an entire community before, and deep down he knew keeping her here was no longer a moment's impulse. Outside, the winter wind moved along the fences, carrying the scent of wood smoke and the promise of a coming storm. But in the kitchen, the fire held steady, warm and unyielding, as though no gale from town could snuff it out. The air inside the great hall of Triple Crown Ranch had gone dense, as if even the dust motes hung motionless. Light spilled from the high windows onto the long table where Jeremiah Cross stood, like a timber post braced in a blizzard, his shadow thrown long and solid across the floorboards. Clara sat a little behind him, near the wall, her hands loosely twined to hide the faint tremor in her fingers. Every gaze in the room, cold, appraising, or openly disdainful, had fixed on the young widow with warm brown skin and a shawl the color of red clay. Not one smile was offered. Horace Pemberton, head of the town council, struck his cane once against the plank floor. The dry crack echoed before he leaned forward, voice carrying an unshakable air of condescension. "Mr. Cross, we are not here for private matters. We are here for the honor of Wyoming. A woman like her will never be accepted in this circle." The words, "a woman like her," slid through the air like a thin blade, sharp enough to draw invisible blood. Clara felt every sidelong glance, every tight whisper. But Jeremiah didn't move, his big hands resting on the table, his eyes sweeping the faces opposite with deliberate slowness. "Honor?" he said, his voice deep as thunder rolling far off. "You want to talk to me about honor?" Horace's brows lifted, the measured calm of his face undermined by the twitch at his mouth. "Yes, and honor requires we steer clear of choices that damage our image." Jeremiah straightened, the gauze of civility falling from his shoulders. His words came slowly, each one set down like an iron spike in timber. "I don't choose people to please your eyes. I choose people who see through to mine." The statement landed hard in the stillness. Clara looked up, meeting his gaze for the first time that morning. It wasn't loud defense, it was a quiet, immovable wall built around her. A derisive huff broke the moment. Milton Grady, one of the county's largest landowners and a council member, leaned forward on one arm. "Fine words, Cross, but she'll drag you into the mud. And when you lose your standing, you'll drag this whole town with you." Jeremiah didn't answer right away. He lifted the coffee pot, poured into his cup, the unhurried movement almost taunting. He set it down, his eyes never leaving Grady. "Milton, you sure you want to talk about mud?" His tone was quiet, carrying to every corner. "Because I know another kind of mud. The kind behind your warehouse where unmarked crates move in and out after midnight." Grady's face blanched before he forced a grin. "My business isn't not relevant?" Jeremiah cut in, voice still even. "When those crates hold Remington rifles bound for Montana, traded for gold from outlaw diggings, it's relevant to all of us. And if I'm not mistaken, Wyoming law calls that a federal crime." Chairs creaked as a few councilmen turned to look at Grady. Horace opened his mouth to intervene, but Jeremiah was already pressing forward. "I don't need your approval for who I welcome under my roof, but perhaps you ought to think on who among us might hang first." Grady swallowed hard, a bead of sweat running down his temple despite the snow beyond the windows. The current in the room shifted. This was no longer a trial of Clara, but the scent of prey had turned toward someone else. Clara stayed still, sensing the long wall of contempt before her crack, a fissure running its length. Jeremiah wasn't just shielding her with words, he was laying his own weight and reputation in the balance. Horace tried to regain the ground. "Mr. Cross, these accusations are true," Jeremiah said, sharper now. "And if need be, I'll have proof in Cheyenne before sundown." Silence fell, heavy enough to press the breath from the room. Someone at the far end shifted in their chair, cleared their throat, and stopped. Jeremiah leaned back slowly, folding his arms, his eyes locking on Horace like a latch. "Now, do you still want to discuss my honor? Or shall we speak of law and the price of silence?" Horace eased back, then glanced toward Grady. The quiet stretched until the snap of the fire in the hearth sounded like gunfire. At last, Horace tapped his cane again, this time softer, his voice dry. "This meeting is adjourned." One by one, the council members rose. Some avoided Clara's eyes. Others dipped their heads too quickly, but none spoke. The great doors swung open, letting in a burst of cold that carried out the scent of wood smoke and the residue of what had just been done here. Jeremiah stood where he was, watching until the last figure disappeared from the porch. Only then did he turn to Clara. Without flourish, he gave a single small nod, a silent message. "You're still here, and so am I." She returned the nod, but inside a slow-burning flame caught. No spark of fear, but one of gratitude braided with a new and unexpected trust. Morning at Triple Crown Ranch always began with the smell of wood smoke slipping through door cracks and the steady beat of hooves on hard ground. Clara had grown used to that rhythm, though she still lived in the small rented house on the edge of town. It wasn't much, but its windows opened to the prairie, where in this season the hayfields lay golden under the Wyoming sun. Each morning, she rose early, boiled water for tea, then readied herself to ride out and help Jeremiah when extra hands were needed. They weren't in any hurry to become a couple. Jeremiah never once spoke of us in the way men often do when they want to stake a claim, and Clara didn't seek it either. After years of hurt, both understood that trust couldn't be built in a rush, like a fence post that had to be sunk deep and wire drawn slow so it wouldn't snap when the wind came hard. At first, Clara's presence on the ranch made some of the hands uneasy. They greeted her with short words, sometimes dodged her eyes, sometimes exchanged looks she could read well enough when she passed. But Jeremiah never let that last long. He didn't shout, didn't make a scene. Just one sharp glance and a few quiet instructions were enough to set the tone. not because they'd suddenly grown fond of her, but because they understood their boss had decided. Working side by side drew the two of them closer, without a word about it. One morning, Jeremiah asked Clara to help sort seed for the coming season. They sat across from each other at the long table in the storage shed, surrounded by burlap sacks, the smell of barley mixing with the scent of old pine. He told her about the land his parents had left him, how he'd pushed its boundaries mile by mile, and about winters so brutal he'd slaughtered cattle to save the rest of the herd. Clara listened, lifting her gaze now and again when he paused mid-sentence, as if to make sure she truly understood. In return, she shared pieces of her life she rarely spoke aloud, about the small plot by the forest she'd once owned, where she'd grown corn, potatoes, a few rows of beans, living almost apart from the town. After the fire, that land had been snapped up by a false creditor, the papers pushed through so fast she hadn't had a chance to fight. Jeremiah listened, then said simply, "We'll get it back." From that day, they began digging through land records, combing the dusty shelves at the courthouse. Jeremiah had no fondness for paperwork, but for Clara's sake he sat for hours at the long oak table of the notary's office, eyes locked on the fine print. Clara, long used to being shut out of such dealings, found herself for the first time sitting as an equal, not as someone receiving charity, but as someone in the fight. During that time, Clara began teaching Jeremiah something he'd left behind: trust. He'd been betrayed by those close, lost land to a handshake that had turned out to be a snare. He was used to guarding secrets, to working alone. Clara didn't push. She was simply there, doing her part, listening without judgment, and meeting his silences with silences of her own, the kind that left room for him to speak when he was ready. One autumn afternoon, riding back from town, Jeremiah suddenly said he'd found a legal gap in the sale of Clara's land. His voice was even, but his eyes lit when he glanced at her. "We can win," he said. And for the first time Clara saw his mouth pull into a true, unguarded smile. She didn't know if it was for the victory ahead or for her company, but that smile stayed with her long after. That evening they sat in the ranch kitchen. The fire crackled merrily, and the smell of stew filled the room. Clara peeled potatoes while Jeremiah split kindling, each busy with their own small task. Yet the air between them carried a shared warmth, the kind that came from beginning to believe this road they were on might stretch further than either had once thought. When Jeremiah stepped outside to shut the stable doors, Clara stood at the window and watched him. His frame was a dark silhouette against the deepening purple sky, his stride steady. In that moment, she realized she was no longer the lost woman who'd come to Wyoming running from the past. She was building her life again, not by clinging to someone, but by walking alongside a man who kept his word, who listened, and who valued a person over the town's judgment. And Jeremiah had changed too. The man who once kept everything close now found reasons to share with Clara, sometimes asking her opinion on a new horse, sometimes inviting her to ride out and check the north fence. With each trip, they talked a little more, laughed a little easier. The start of their story was nothing like the romances the town liked to tell. There was no proposal under lamplight, no flowery vows. Just two people, worn by what life had taken from them, choosing to sit by the same fire, to share what they had, and to lay each new brick of trust in place. And though neither spoke it aloud, both Clara and Jeremiah knew this was only the beginning. Snow had been falling since morning, not in a rush, but flake by flake, settling quietly on the endless prairie. The ground lay under a clean white sheet, so that every footprint, every wheel rut, every horseshoe mark stood out, as if time itself were carving each moment into memory. On the old wooden fence, rails darkened by years of rain and sun now carried a thin glaze of ice, catching the silver light of a winter afternoon. Far off, the Absaroka Range lay shrouded in mist, rising and fading like a fortress wall keeping the secrets of this land. Jeremiah stood there, broad shoulders wrapped in a thick coat, the brim of his hat pulled low to shadow most of his face. If he felt the cold, he didn't show it, either because he didn't or because he'd long since made peace with it. Beside him, Clara stood silent. A smoke-gray wool scarf was wrapped at her neck. A few curls had slipped from her bun, brushing her cheek and catching the dampness of melting snow. They didn't touch. They didn't even glance at each other. Yet the space between them was so narrow that the smallest shift would have brought their shoulders together. There was no need for words. The language of this moment was in what went unspoken. Jeremiah, the man who had turned down every match arranged by powerful families, every fine-faced woman sent only to tie her name to his fortune, now stood here beside a woman the town had once tried to cast out. Clara, who had walked through a gauntlet of contemptuous glances and whispered slurs, now no longer lowered her gaze or stepped aside. They both looked out over the open prairie, where the wind sent thin veils of snow drifting like smoke, and Jeremiah's horses grazed at their hay unfazed by the cold. Each breath from them curled into the frosty air, their clouds of vapor mingling before fading into one. In that scene, there was no thought of counseled disputes, accusations, or the scars of the past. All of it shrank down to this: two people facing the same horizon, sharing a view no one else could claim. In the West, where love stories were so often built from ambition, land, and leverage, folks would talk about that image for years. They would say it was not a grand alliance forged to strengthen holdings, nor a romance lit by diamonds and fancy parties. It was love that chose the heart over prestige, a choice that set the whole of Wyoming to talking, because it challenged laws unwritten yet ironclad for generations. Maybe someday Jeremiah and Clara would stand together as husband and wife. Or maybe they'd keep just this space between them. It didn't matter. What mattered was that from that day on, the love stories of the Wild West had to make room for a new chapter, one of resolve, of two souls willing to stand side by side through every storm, forcing the town to ask itself what love really was. In the end, their story wasn't a loud ballad, but the quiet murmur of two hearts that had been broken, finding each other in the dust and wind. There was no grand wedding, no gilded vows, only long days of shared work, silent afternoons by the fence, and glances that carried more than 1,000 words. In a land hardened by prejudice and unwritten rules, they had chosen the harder road, the road of truth. And perhaps, when years have worn away the shine from everything else, we all come to know. Real happiness isn't in what dazzles the eye, but in a hand that doesn't let go when the cold winds rise. If this story touched a memory or stirred your heart, hit like and subscribe to ride along for more Wild West love stories, where human kindness stands stronger than prejudice. And don't hesitate to leave a comment, sharing the love story of your own. Who knows? Your tale might just become a Wild West love story remembered for a lifetime.